distinguished guests, and dear new students. So, Burkhard Jung already mentioned it. 30 years ago, on September 4th, 1989, Leipzig witnessed the first Monday demonstrations, where 1,200 citizens brandished a banner for an open country with free people. By November 6th, the Leipzig Monday demonstrations had grown to 500,000 people. On November 9th, the wall came down. With the reunification of Germany and the end of the Soviet Union, there was a widespread sense of a clear direction for the future, characterized by free markets, global trade, and a liberal democracy. Or as Francis Fukuyama put it at the time, mankind had reached the end of history. In the 30 years since then, I have divided my professional life about equally between time spent in the for-profit sector, at McKinsey, at General Electric, in my own startup, and in the non-profit sector, UNICEF and various foundations. And one clear lesson I've learned over the years is that we have not reached the end of history. On the contrary, I would like to argue today that you are entering business school at a particularly open point in time. The future is wide open, it is dialectical, and a lot will depend on whether you are prepared well for the risks and the opportunities. Let me highlight 3 structural developments that will deeply affect the next 30 years and reflect on what these mean for your studies. The first structural development is the ambiguity of digitization and artificial intelligence. I'm a computer scientist by training, I should say. As digitization is expanding through the Internet of Things and becoming ubiquitous, more and more spheres of our lives and workplaces will change through artificial intelligence in the next 30 years. Humanity is on the verge of a revolution in human reasoning, decision-making, and relationships, with high impact but also very high risks. To leverage these technologies properly and employ them responsibly, one first needs to understand the basic ideas behind them. Thus, tools like agent-based modeling, deep learning, natural language processing, recommender systems should be part of your learning agenda. AI tools such as these will be your inevitable companions in the next 30 years, either by automating an extraordinary amount of tasks or by decisively enhancing your decision-making capabilities. The good news is that in the highly digitized world that we are living in and we are further entering in, computing resources and algorithms are readily available in the cloud at no fixed cost, at very low variable cost. So nothing is stopping you from learning to play with these tools at almost no cost. And you can use them to prototype new business ideas and to literally make things happen in the virtual world at very limited risk, very limited financial risk. There are hardly any limiting factors for becoming an entrepreneur in that digital world. You have to be able not to raise capital, but you have to be able to have an idea and to execute well primarily. The bad news is, however, that in this world, potential for nonlinear change increases massively. We can expect not only many business models, but also many jobs. Job concepts will be fundamentally changed, disrupted in the next 30 years through artificial intelligence and robotization. There's also a large risk that the quality of human consciousness, learning, and social interactions will deteriorate, will get worse because of ubiquitous digitization and reliance on AI. Our attention spans may shorten. I have 4 children. Actually, they have shortened. Our capability for deep reflection may decrease. Our reliance on facts in the face of deep fakes may no longer hold up. And our aspirations for free will and autonomy may decline. In fact, as for any new and powerful technology, AI's promise is ambiguous. It is creating a learning bonanza and a privacy challenge. It opens new frontiers of knowledge and enhances the capacity to suppress, manipulate, challenging ideas. It enhances comfort based on big data patterns, and it fundamentally challenges our concepts of freedom and democracy. Most business managers, or rather most human beings, are not really well prepared for dealing with this disruptive change. We are well prepared for dealing with small incremental changes. Thus, we will need to develop personal, organizational, and societal resilience to address these nonlinear changes productively. This starts with the ability to think systemically and avoid the thinking in silos. It includes the responsibility to think beyond the short-term gains in comfort or productivity from a new tool, and to recognize collateral effects and potential long-term damages and risks to our human essence. You will need to develop clear principles and values to guide you in times where machines will assist and probably or possibly surpass humans in mental labor, prediction, and in the shaping of outcomes. The second structural trend that I see is the pressure on societal cohesion. Income and wealth have grown enormously over the past 30 years. Looking at the progress in reaching the Millennium Goals, billions of people have emerged from extreme poverty and have gained access to health and education. The global free trade regime has been a major driver of this progress. At the same time, income and wealth inequality have grown tremendously. Today, the richest 8% earn more than half of the world's income, and the richest 1% own more than half of all wealth. The poorest 1 billion people account for just 1% of all consumption, the richest for about 3/4. This in turn has become a major cause of rising political and social tension that are, quote, tearing apart the fabric of our societies. This quote is from Paul Collier from his book, The Future of Capitalism. It's creating a new set of divides. Educated people, like yourself, who have skills valued in the global market economy, tend to live in metropolitan areas, beautiful places like Leipzig, and have a shared identity that crosses national boundaries. The less educated, typically, are living in the countryside. They feel left behind, and that leads to resentment and fear. And as Collier wrote, they recognize that the well-educated are distancing themselves socially and culturally. Brexit, Trump, and the Yellow Vest protests can all be interpreted through this lens. Thus, we face a major ambiguity of the global market regime. A growth dynamic that often seems to exceed policymakers' ability to set and enforce boundaries and rules. The corroding effect of this dynamic and complexity beyond control is increasing the fragility of our societies. Business leaders in the next 30 years will not be able to ignore this increasing fragility of societies by clinging to the illusion of a free market, rational choice, and every man meritocracy as their reference points. Reality is much more complex, it's a social construct, and it's much more complex than even behavioral economics might suggest. Most of the complexity that comes with the intensive interdependence of human and contextual decision factors still is beyond our grasp. It still eludes us. What is clear is that most social processes are not neatly decomposable into separate sub-processes: economic, demographic, cultural, or spatial. Yet this compartmentalization in insular departments and journals is how we tend to organize the studies. In order to develop realistic and relevant life perspectives and robust business strategies, you should not only learn about strategy, finance, marketing, accounting, but equally important about sociology, about political economy, about philosophy and ethics. In particular, you need to avoid the dangers of reductionism and of easy simplifications as actions based on such frames lead in complex social systems to unforeseen higher order effects and non-sustainable impacts. Be aware that PowerPoint slides with 3 bullet points, and I say that as a former McKinsey partner, or 3 metrics are widely used in both business schools, McKinsey, or in the business world in general, but they constitute only a very, very narrow form of communication. Not good communication. Many business leaders pride themselves on being able to reduce complex reality to the simplicity of these 3 bullet points, or these 3 key metrics. To be fair, they help when you have to execute to get something done. And it strengthens your ability to execute. On the other hand, however, revenue, EBITDA, market share metrics are simply not good enough as purpose of an organization, nor is GDP good enough to capture the quality of a society. As Robert Kennedy put it, the cross-national product measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. This is especially true if the distribution of wealth is left to real-world markets that do not allocate according to morally defensible criteria. Similarly, complex relationships between individuals should not be reduced to transactions only. Even if Tinder and Facebook suggest that simple transactional templates can capture love or friendship. Let me put it bluntly. You will not be able anymore to claim success as a business leader if it comes at the price of the destruction of social capital and social cohesion. At the most elementary level, the triumph of individual fulfillment through personal achievement over meeting obligations to family and community is psychologically deeply flawed. Again, reflect on your principles and values to avoid falling into these traps. The third structural trend is the need to mitigate climate change. I worked for 6 years on climate change as the CEO of the European Climate Foundation in the run-up to the Paris Summit. During this time, I became acutely aware of the tragedy of the commons and the tragedy of the horizons. Now, the commons denote the natural resources that are accessible to all members of society, and including particular our oceans and our atmosphere. The tragedy of the commons is a situation where individuals and nations deplete or spoil the atmosphere or the oceans driven by their perceived short-term interest, contrary to the common long-term good. As a result, we now face the risk of existential tipping points, of irreversible climate change, that have a moral dimension, because it's the man-made carbon emission, greenhouse gas emissions, that are the driving factor that make the crucial difference. In the face of this challenge, the contemporary political economy has the dangerous tendency to shift difficult problems into the future and to lobby against taking full account of externalities. However, our current patterns of consumption are simply not sustainable. And it is irresponsible to shift the problems into the future. In the face of boundaries on the use of the commons and resource constraints, Jared Diamond recently pointed out that it feels like a cruel joke if developing nations are told that they can aspire to our Western lifestyles if only they embrace our economic regimes. It's a cruel hoax. Thus, I think it's an easy prediction that I can make that our economic orthodoxy will move beyond neoliberalism and shareholder value in the next 30 years. The increasingly visible indications of the gravity of the climate change challenges will force us out of the denial that we are still in today with our implicit expectations that unlimited consumerism and the expansion of Western lifestyle and ecological footprints across the world can be extrapolated as the basis for continued growth. For me, it is not a question of whether this pattern will break down, but only of when it will break down within the next 30 years. And the next 30 years is your professional lifespan. Given what we know today, it would be irresponsible and frankly plain stupid to ignore the existential risks from climate change only because they are hard to compute and in the long tail of distribution. Because of the enormity of human-induced climate change, there will be huge opportunities that come with it, from weaning us from the deep dependence on fossil fuel as a driver of prosperity, from changing business systems to make them circular, from new patterns of consumption that drastically reduce the ecological footprint. In fact, I believe that in the next 30 years we will see many more exciting and fulfilling business opportunities to make our societies more sustainable compared to adding yet another entertainment app to the App Store, even if it makes you a unicorn. Most of these opportunities will not only involve entrepreneurial, but also regulatory innovation. As the scale and the level of behavioral change and lifestyle changes necessary can only be achieved, from my point of view, via concerted action or forced upon us by war, which we don't want. Thus, you should expect to work in environments where new forms of cooperation with governments and civil society will address these challenges. And you will need to be able to operate in those public-private partnerships of new scale and new importance. This calls for your ability to think not only in economic, but also in political and ethical terms. You will need to think beyond the short term, and you need to develop a moral compass and a sense of long-term responsibility that provides robust orientation in contexts of high complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity. Let me conclude. I've submitted 3 structural trends to you: the ambiguity of digitization and AI, the pressures on societal cohesion, and the need to mitigate climate change, that I believe will shape your working lives in the next 30 years. In the face of these complex dynamics and the failure of current regimes to address these challenges adequately, it is imperative that you approach the future with a critical mind. Beware of making business as usual assumptions, as I'm convinced that the next 30 years will expose many of them as no longer relevant and valid. Develop an open and skeptical mindset to think outside the box of current orthodoxies and mainstream models. Being here in Leipzig, 30 years after the Monday demonstrations and the reunification of Germany, should give us a sense that monumental change is possible and that it can happen at very short notice. So much has changed over the last 30 years, and I couldn't agree more with Burkhard Jung, looking at the beauty and the vibrancy of this wonderful city, so that I want to add optimism as my final necessary ingredient for your studies, to address these strengths and to be able to address them in a constructive manner. Optimistic thinking about the future enables the necessary imagination and ambition. Your time at HHL should help you get ready for these changes rather than extrapolate the status quo. Your studies here should prepare you for taking responsibility for shaping those changes rather than functioning in an unsustainable extrapolation of the business as usual mindset. The future is open, and with the combination of skepticism and optimism, I'm sure we will make the best of it. Good luck.